guys, so this lesson is going to be more practical than theoretical. I'm going to go over many of the theoretical concepts I covered in my other videos and show you how to apply them in practice to a jazz standard. In particular, I'm going to try to explain step by step how to go about learning how to improvise over a new song by using things like chord mapping, finding common scales, and just generally planning your improvisation. Because contrary to the name, improvisation actually takes quite a lot of planning, preparation, and practice. I should also say that there's no correct way of learning a new song or preparing how to improvise. It's all entirely subjective. So what I'm going to tell you is what I personally do when I'm learning a new song. And if you don't like something, or you disagree with me, or you don't find something useful, then you don't have to do it. In the end, how you prepare is merely down to personal taste and learning styles. Now in this lesson, I'm going to be using the jazz standard Satin Doll as my example. So let's start. Now, every time I begin learning a new song or learning how to improvise over a new song, I do the following steps. First, I learn the chords and the melody, then I learn arpeggios, then I do something called chord mapping, which I'll show you in a moment. Then I try find any common scales that exist through all the keys in the song. Then I add in any more exotic scales if I so feel. Then I apply various jazz improvisation techniques, which I cover in a whole separate video series. And finally, I then add jazzier chord voicings, which I also cover in a separate video series. So whenever I pick a new song I want to learn, the very first thing I do, even before I touch the piano, even before I start learning how to play the song, is I create the following table, which you can see up here in the picture-in-picture. So I write out all the chords in the song, then the keys to which all of those chords relate, and therefore the scales I'm going to use to improvise over this song. Then I write out the guide tones of each chord and the avoid notes of each chord. And then I go through the steps that I listed before. So step 1 is learn the chords and the melody. So I would play something like this. So that's just the basic chords and the basic melody of section A of Satin Doll. Now it's obviously very important that you learn the chords and the melody really well, because every good and strong improvisation is based off the chords and the melody. Next, I practice playing arpeggios, where I play arpeggios over every single chord in the chord progression using something called melodic continuity, which essentially just means playing equal quavers all the way through without varying your rhythm or without inserting rests or anything like that, just playing even quavers. So just playing simple arpeggios over the chord progression, and that exercise really lets you sort of hone in on the harmony of the chord progression because you're targeting all the notes in the chords. Next, I play the guide tones of the chord progression. Now the guide tones are just the 3rd and the 7th of each chord, and harmonically they're the strongest notes you can play. So this is essentially an exercise to help you identify and target the guide tones of the chord progression, so that when you're improvising, you know where the guide tones are, so you can quite easily target your guide tones in your improvisation and therefore create a really harmonically strong and grounded improvisation. So first I play them one at a time or individually, so and then the other guide tone. And then I practice them together. I practice that quite a lot because I really want to memorize where all the guide tones are and how they move in this chord progression, because so when I'm improvising, it's quite easy for me to sort of be playing whatever I like and then just fall back onto a guide tone and really ground that improvisation on a really harmonically strong note. And as you just saw, guide tones generally move by half step or by a whole step in a chord progression. And in fact, this is one of the things that makes a chord progression flow smoothly, if guide tones sort of move one into the other quite smoothly without jumping around too much. Then I practice avoiding the avoid note. Obviously, that's difficult to do, so it's just something I keep in mind when I'm improvising. You take note of all the avoid notes, and then just when you're improvising, make sure to try to generally avoid the avoid notes, or if you're going to use one, just use them quickly as passing notes. Don't try and sort of sit on an avoid note for too long. Then, as you see up here, I've mapped out all the keys that the chords relate to. So for example, the D minor 7 to the G7 is in C major, then it goes to E minor 7 to A7, that's in D major, then it goes down to G major, then it goes down to G flat major, and then back to C major. So those are all the keys that the chords relate to. That means I can use these scales to improvise over those chords. So then I would practice exactly that. I would just play the same chord progression and just practice the scales, just playing up and down, playing the related scales for each chord. So then you can get something like this. So I was just playing the related scale over each of the chords. So C major for the first two bars, D major for the second two bars, and so on. And just playing up and down the scale, again playing in constant quavers. Then when you're comfortable using the various diatonic scales over this chord progression, you can start using the exact same scales, but instead of just playing up and down, sort of just creating little melodies and targeting the guide tones and trying to avoid the avoid notes. And just creating a really simple, nice little improvisation. Again, using these scales over these chords. Or something like that. So this table and this entire process is called chord mapping. You essentially take the chords and map them to the relevant key, to the relevant guide tones, and to the relevant avoid notes. And then just continue practicing each one of those things individually until you're capable and feel comfortable using all those ideas and guide tones and scales and so on over this chord progression. Now, the next thing I do when learning how to improvise over a new song is to find a common scale. Now, a common scale is a single scale which fits across all or most of the keys and therefore all or most of the chords. Now, for this, the pentatonic and the blues scale are especially good because they only have 5 or 6 notes and so generally fit into many diatonic scales. The downside with this is that pentatonic scales can skip guide tones, which can make them sort of a little bit harmonically weaker as scales, but they make up for this by being really simple and really pleasant sounding, just because of the way that they're structured. And the other reason I use pentatonics and blues scales is because I really like the blues and I really like the sound of the blues scale, and so I like incorporating them into my solo. Now, in order to find a common scale, you write out all of the keys that you find in the song and their associated scale. So in Satin Doll, we have the keys of C major, D major, G major, and G flat major. So we write out those 4 scales, as I've done in the picture-in-picture up here, and we look for a common scale. Now, the first common scale we can use is G major pentatonic, which has the notes G, A, B, D, E. Now, as you can see, those 5 notes are found in 3 out of 4 of the scales in Satin Doll. The only key that this scale doesn't fit is G flat major. So that means G major pentatonic fits over that entire chord progression except for in bar 6, where the song temporarily goes to G flat major. Now you could change scale for that one bar and pick a scale that fits over that G flat major. But because it's only for a bar and so relatively quick before it drops back into C major 7, we can just continue using the G major pentatonic over that bar, and it's going to clash and it's going to create some tension and it's going to create some dissonance. However, that's perfectly fine in jazz because it's only for a short period of time, so we're creating some tension for that one bar by using that same scale which doesn't quite fit, before the chord goes back to C major 7 and the G major pentatonic scale fits well again. So we're effectively creating tension for one bar by using a scale that doesn't quite fit over the chords before resolving that tension by playing a scale that fits over the following chord, the C major 7. And not only does that sound good because you're creating tension and then resolving that tension, and that's essentially what jazz improvisation is all about, but it's also nice and simple because you're using the same scale over all 8 bars. Now, I told you earlier that I like the sound of the blues scale, and actually G major pentatonic is actually exactly the same as E minor pentatonic. It's got all the same notes, right? One's just a mode of the other. And the E blues scale is the same as the E minor pentatonic, just with an added B flat. So that's in a sense going to act as a passing note. So what we've essentially done is we've found our first common scale that we can use over the entire chord progression of section A of Satin Doll. And so using an E blues scale over this chord progression can sound something like this. Right, so that was nice and easy. Even though this chord progression goes through 4 different keys, we found a single common scale that we can use over all of those keys, and therefore can use over this entire chord progression. And so it's actually really, really easy to improvise over this chord progression because you're just using one scale. Now the next common scale we can use is C major pentatonic, or A blues scale. Now again, this scale fits relatively well. It fits over the C major, it fits over the G major, and it fits relatively well over the D major, except for the fact that in the C major pentatonic we have a C, whereas in D major we have a C sharp. So while the C major pentatonic doesn't fit the key of D major perfectly, it fits it relatively well. And all you have to do when you're improvising is just be careful when you use the note C. And again, C major pentatonic doesn't quite fit over the G flat major, but again we're going to do the exact same thing as we did with the last common scale, and just continue playing that same scale all the way through and just create a bit of tension and then resolve that tension. So then, using a blues scale to improvise over the chord progression of Satin Doll will sound like this. So again, we found another common scale that we can use to improvise over that entire chord progression, even though the chord progression changes through 4 different keys. Now the final common scale that I'm going to cover here that we can use over this chord progression is the G blues scale. Now, while prima facie the G blues scale doesn't look like it quite fits into our 4 keys or our 4 diatonic scales, it actually does fit the chords quite well. Now, I've got a completely separate video where I explain this in detail, essentially why you can use different scales over the same chords. But in short, you can use any scale over a particular chord as long as that scale has the 3rd and the 7th, that is the guide tones, of that chord. Over the D minor 7, we can use any scale that has an F and a C. And the G blues scale has both of those notes. Over the G7, we can use any scale that has an F and a B. Now the G blues scale has an F. It doesn't have a B, it does have a B flat, which in a sense acts as a sharp 9 from the point of view of the G7. And so it doesn't really have a third. But anyway, watch that video if you want sort of that explained in a bit more detail. But the G blues scale actually fits rather nicely over a G7. Next, over the E minor 7, we find that the third and the 7th are the G and the D, both of which are in the G blues scale. Over the A7, the third and the 7th are the C sharp and the G, again, both of which are in the G blues scale. Over the A minor 7, the third C and the 7th G are again both in the G blues scale. Then over the D7, the third is the F sharp and the 7th is the C. We've got the C in the G blues scale, but we don't have an F sharp. So it doesn't quite fit perfectly there, but it's kind of close enough. And so while the G blues scale won't fit over every single chord in the keys of C major, D major, and G major, over these particular chords in this chord progression, it actually fits quite well. The only chord it really doesn't fit is this C major 7 because it doesn't have an E or a B. And so when we get to the C major 7 of this chord progression, we need to change key. But again, playing over this chord progression using the G blues scale can sound like this. And so there you go, you found 3 common scales that you can use over the entire chord progression, or almost the entire chord progression. And so the next thing you can do to make your improvisation a little bit more interesting is to start combining each of these 3 common scales, sort of jump between one and then another, until you have a somewhat more interesting solo. So something like this. And so all I was doing there was using E, G, and A blues scale and sort of just mixing and matching them, going from one to the other completely at random, because all 3 of those common scales fit over the entire chord progression. So it doesn't really matter which scale you use at what point. You just sort of mix and match between them, and you can create a rather interesting solo that's really quite conceptually and intellectually quite simple, because you're just using 3 different blues scales. Now, after you've done all that and you're pretty comfortable doing all of those things, you can start inserting more exotic scales. For example, you can chuck in a whole tone scale or a diminished scale over one of the dominant 7 chords or something like that to make your improvisation even more interesting. And I cover these more exotic scales in my video series on jazz scales, so you can go have a look at that if you like. Then on top of that, you can add some jazz improvisation techniques such as passing notes or cycled patterns or chromatic scales or things of that nature, or some bitonality or side slipping or whatever. And again, I've got a whole separate video series on that, so you can go have a look. And now, using all of those ideas, you can now come up with a relatively interesting improvisation over this chord progression. And then finally, you can add some jazzier sounding chord voicings, which again, I have a completely separate video series on, if that's something you're interested in. So that's really all I wanted to cover in this lesson. So hopefully that gives you some ideas about how to incorporate a lot of these sort of theoretical musical ideas into practice and actually apply them to a jazz standard. So next time you start learning a new song, make sure you map out all the chords, write down the keys that all the chords relate to, the guide tones, the avoid notes, and then try find some common scales between all of the keys, and then just try practicing that. And you'll find that it's actually a nice and simple and actually quite effective way to begin improvising and to practice. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys, and as always, feel free to leave any questions or comments. And otherwise, yeah, thanks. See ya.